Welcome back, my friends. So the economy being what it is right now, it is a tough time for many Canadians. New data reveals our average credit card balance across the country has soared to levels not seen in nearly 2 decades. And young people are being hit the hardest and bearing the brunt of it. Here with tips on how to get a handle on debt is money expert and keynote speaker Robyn Thompson. Hey, Robyn.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. I'm so glad you're here. This is such an important issue to talk about. And the numbers are pretty shocking. Like second quarter of this year, overall consumer debt hit $2.5 trillion. Yeah. It's a massive number, and it's so important to remember, though, that behind these numbers are real people, many of whom are struggling and suffering a lot of financial stress. So put it into context for us. Like, what's happening here? How did we get here?
And you're right. And that's the thing, is that these are real people behind these cards. These are real people struggling financially.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing generally overall is that we have seen interest rate and inflation start to subsidize a little bit, start to come down. But we're not really seeing that trickle down into things like lines of credit, loans, and mortgages. So we're still seeing really high overall cost of borrowing.
Yeah.
And I think that what we're also seeing is that stabilization or pretty much flat consumer spending. So when we look at credit card debt, we're looking at the balance between what do people need in order to be able to meet their lifestyle expenses, and what are people bringing in, and where are people bridging that gap? And they're bridging the gap by credit card. So average credit card was about $4,300.
Wow.
So it's the highest on record in, again, almost 2 decades for credit cards.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah. And, you know, perhaps not surprisingly, young people are bearing a lot of this financial stress. Yeah. That age demographic of like 26 to 35 years old, they're especially missing out on a lot of payments. So for young people, what's causing their financial stress and driving this debt?
Yeah, and they have a whole other set of scenarios they have to work with. So one of the things would be looking at what are their specific situations. So one would be student debt. So in addition to the regular expenses they now have the student debt they continue to carry, which obviously is an extra expense. They also have things like their earning capacity is a little lower. They're just starting out their career, so they're not at the maximum capacity for their earnings potential. So the income they're bringing in is less than they obviously want to be later on in the years. So what does that mean for debt repayment? And then lastly, a high housing cost. So housing costs, obviously, we're seeing some of the prices of housing come down, but we do have different pockets throughout the country. And then what do borrowing costs look like? How do they have enough money to be able to put the down payment and then have the affordability to be able to manage those payments over long periods of time?
Yeah, and you mentioned housing. Obviously, real estate's such a big piece of our national kind of economic puzzle. Before the break, Lindsay and Erica were talking about the market. For this younger demographic, we're talking about how has the cost of housing impacted their debt load and their financial situation?
I mean, they are under an enormous amount of stress. They're in a period at this point where they're trying to save up to buy a house, to get into the market. It's been out of reach for many people, essentially 2/3 of younger generation living paycheck to paycheck, which is really hard to see. And they're really having to adjust their monthly income to be able to support their lifestyle. And, you know, housing is really expensive. So it's coming out of groceries, it's coming out of debt payments, it's coming out of investments. Yeah. So it's a really difficult time for people who are younger trying to get into the market. But they have to be continually conscious about savings to be able to put money away towards being able to buy a house.
So say somebody's watching, especially somebody in that younger demographic, they have a lot of credit card debt. What's a good strategy for paying it off without kind of racking up more high interest payments and avoiding impacting your credit score? How can people do this?
Well, the first thing to remember is to really try to look at the interest on the cards and be like, how can I pay that down? How can I increase my credit? You don't need to wait for your credit card bill to come in. So when you have money, start paying down your credit cards throughout the month. That's going to reduce the overall interest that you pay, and it's also going to give you smaller amounts that you can sort of dig your teeth into versus that one big overwhelming amount. Yeah. And then there's a couple different strategies you can look to pay down debt. So we have the snowball, which is one debt type of strategy, which essentially means you're starting off with the lowest credit card balance and you're paying that off. You're taking the minimums on the other cards, but the lowest balance, paying that off. As soon as that's paid off, you move to the next card and so on and so on. Right. And this gives you that sort of psychological boost to be like, okay, that one's paid off, I can keep moving on with another one. Yeah. And so the opposite of that would be the avalanche method, and that is where you're looking at the highest interest rate card and you're paying that one first. Okay. So minimum amounts on the other cards, but this one you're tackling down the highest interest rate debt, which means you're going to pay less interest overall on your credit cards. So really important, take a look at the cards, make sure you're paying the minimum balance at least to make sure your credit card stays intact, and then you want to make sure you're paying down the highest interest rate one first.
Got it. I love your strategies. Now in terms of kind of avoiding getting into credit card debt, or maybe once you've paid it off, what's a good rule of thumb for spending on credit, spending with credit cards so that people don't get into trouble?
We want to stay under 30% in your capacity rate. So make sure you're 30% of what your entire borrowing limit is. So that will help you with your credit score. And then also it could be just as simple as understanding maybe you need to spend a little bit much more time learning about how you're spending your money.
Right.
So, you know, it could be as simple as taking out cash and using cash for the month. Yes, you'll forego some of your, you know, miles that you won't be collecting, but it might be getting into a habit of how much are you actually spending and controlling your spending, and then controlling your debt. And remember that debt is a privilege, right? Debt can be taken, or credit is a privilege rather, and it can be taken away at any point. So make sure that you are managing your credit, you're making your payments on time, you are being a responsible person with credit, so you continue to have credit as you move throughout the different stages in your life.
Robyn, thank you so much for putting this into context and for some great strategies too.
You're so welcome. It's always great to be here.
All right.
If you liked that video, make sure to subscribe to the Your Morning YouTube feed, where you can find all kinds of new content posted every weekday morning.